A trip back in time. We're on Mackinac Island to get the history on Fort Mackinac.
The Americans took over Fort Mackinac after the War of 1812 again, and they continued to garrison it until 1895. So it was a fort that had a very long history.
And a trip to the Keweenaw for a look at the Eagle Harbor Lighthouse. 9 million acres of forest, 1,700 miles of continuous shoreline, 4,300 lakes, 12,000 miles of streams, more than 300 waterfalls, 15 counties, 2 time zones, and 1 area code. Welcome to the Upper Peninsula. Welcome to 906 Outdoors. .906 Outdoors is brought to you by Cooking Wild Seasonings. Make it fresh, make it yours. The sound of horses clopping along carless streets, the rich smell of fudge thick in the air, and the unique sense of relaxation and disconnect from everywhere else. Mackinac Island is a popular destination for tourists from near and far, but its history reaches far beyond the modern days of a ferry ride over and a box of tasty fudge. Fort Mackinac, or Michilimackinac as it was originally called, dates back to the 1700s. And played a role in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Battle of Mackinac Island in 1814. It was America's second national park, before becoming Michigan's first state park. It's home to some of the oldest buildings in the state. Today, visitors can tour the fort and explore its original buildings. Exhibits, demonstrations, and cannon firings bring to life everything from military training and battles to medical treatments and family life within the fort.
Fort Mackinac is Michigan's only Revolutionary-era fort. It came into existence in 1779 when the fort, which was originally located on the south side of the Straits, was moved here to Mackinac Island, and that was because of the American Revolution. The fort by that period was under British control, and owing to some American victories down in Ohio country, they felt very threatened. The fort on the south side of the Straits was built right on the beach, very vulnerable to cannon attack from a sailing vessel if the rebels brought it up here. So the British made the decision to move the fort and the community over here to Mackinac Island. And that occurred between 1779 and 1781. The island offered things that the mainland location lacked. These nice high bluffs to put the fort upon, and in addition there was a nice harbor here. The British moved the fort over here, but of course the American Revolution ended with an American victory, and part of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 put the Great Lakes region into the new United States, so this became an American fort. It took 13 years for the Americans to finally get here and take the fort over. No one was really sure that this American United States thing was going to last. The new country was in no position to take over these outlying outposts, and the British really didn't want to give it up. They were still running the fur trade in this region. But finally, in 1796, the Americans officially took over Fort Mackinac. The British marched out, the Americans marched in. But the British didn't go very far away. They went to about 40 miles to the east, to St. Joseph's Island, and they established a new fort. That was the closest available British territory to the Straits of Mackinac, showing what a strategic location this still was. And so the British were in a very good position when in 1812 hostilities erupted again between the United States and Great Britain. The British found out about the declaration of war first in July 1812. The Americans were unaware of it, and they snuck over here and surprised the Americans. They had built this fort, the British. They knew that its fatal flaw was it was very vulnerable from an attack from the rear without another defensive installment back behind the fort, something the British had planned from the beginning. They had never done. The Americans hadn't gotten around to doing that, to putting in that additional fortification, so the British exploited that fall and they took over the fort, demanding surrender. There were 600 British regulars, again, that had snuck onto Mackinac Island under cover of darkness, waiting behind the fort. There were 60 Americans in Fort Mackinac on that day, so the American commander surrendered almost immediately. He said later, in order to prevent a general slaughter, all I could do was surrender. This was one of the, if not the first, land engagement of the War of 1812 in the United States, the capture of Fort Mackinac.
906 Outdoors is brought to you in part by Christ, your Northwoods neighborhood store.
All right, we're about to have our Firearms of Mackinac demonstration where we show different time periods of different soldiers that would have been stationed here at Fort Mackinac over a nearly 100-year span. Beginning with the War of 1812 with myself, going over how there's rather some interesting combat that was occurring up here on Mackinac Island. There was actually a Battle of Mackinac Island during the summer of 1814. And then we'll transfer over during the Civil War, how the island served as a prisoner of war camp for about 5 months. And then we transfer quick over to the 1880s, which we mainly focused on our programming when the soldiers stationed here were essentially serving as park rangers for the national park. We'll be talking about what they were doing up here at those exact times. They were up here for rather unique purposes, but also talking about their arms they would have been using, and we're going to try and shoot them off for you at the very end.
By 1814, the War of 1812 was still ongoing. By that time, there had been some major American naval victories on the Great Lakes. They were ready by July of 1814 to come and try to recapture Mackinac Island. They tried to fire on the fort from the water below. They couldn't raise their cannons high enough to do so, so they went around to the back of the island to that same point the British had marched in back in 1812. Again, it wasn't a surprise attack this time. The British knew they were here, obviously, and the Americans marched onto the island. The British marched in Fort Mackinac, and they engaged in a battle at the center of Mackinac Island in August 1814. About evenly matched. There was a turning point in the battle, however, where the British got the best of the Americans. A number of American soldiers were killed. They eventually called retreat, and the British were victorious here at Mackinac Island throughout the War of 1812. It was only returned to America as part of the Treaty of Ghent the following year. Fort Holmes was built by the British. It really wasn't a separate fort. It was part of the operation of Fort Mackinac, and they originally called it Fort George. They built that right after they captured Fort Mackinac during the War of 1812 to protect Mackinac from the rear. Again, they had exploited that flaw. Now they were going to ensure that the Americans couldn't come back and do the same thing. And it protected that vulnerable high ground behind Fort Mackinac. When the Americans returned to the island after 1815, they renamed the fort Fort Holmes in honor of an officer who had been killed in the battle of 1814. The Americans manned it for a few years after that, but very soon they shut it down. It was no longer necessary. I mean, we were at peace with Great Britain. The nature of warfare had changed. There were now bigger guns on vessels within a few years that if somebody actually would come here to attack Fort Mackinac, they would have attacked from the water. It was abandoned. It returned to dust, but beginning in the early 20th century, various reconstructions of it were placed up there. A very accurate one was done in the 1930s, and then to commemorate the bicentennial, we did a further reconstruction of the fort and opened that as part of our celebration of the bicentennial of the War of 1812. Fortunately, the American government had done some very detailed drawings of the fort while it still existed, and they're in the National Archives in Washington, and they were used both in the 1930s reconstruction and in the most recent one. The Americans took over Fort Mackinac after the War of 1812 again, and they continued to garrison it until 1895. So it was a fort that had a very long history. By the time it shut down in 1895, it was an antique fort. It was actually recognized by the Army for its historic importance in those latter years, because a lot of forts in American history just didn't last that long. Today, the 14 buildings inside the fort walls are all original. These are buildings that were constructed throughout the fort's history, the oldest dating to 1780, the blockhouses to the late 1700s, early 1800s. The rest of the structures completed over the following decades. The final one was completed in 1885. So nothing reconstructed here at Fort Mackinac. Again, all original arming buildings, some of the oldest standing structures in the state of Michigan. The walls of Fort Mackinac, officer stone quarters started by the British. That's the oldest public building anywhere in Michigan today. Stone quarters, the oldest building at Fort Mackinac, was started by the British in 1780, never completed by them, but the Americans completed it when they took over the fort in 1796, and it was used as an officer's quarters, so it's officers' stone quarters. It's a duplex dwelling, so one officer, his family occupied one half, another officer and his family the other half. Comfortable quarters, stunning views from the front of it. Bathrooms and flush toilets were installed in the 1880s, so by that time it was a very modern building. It contains exhibits today showing how the building was used during the American occupancy. And on the lower level is our tea room, our restaurant here at Fort Mackinac, providing the best views of any restaurant on Mackinac Island.
Today's show is brought to you in part by Rapid River Knife Works, home of Michigan's largest custom knife factory showroom.
You know, as I noted, there's a lot of really old buildings inside Fort Mackinac, the oldest standing public building in Michigan, and stone quarters, and next to it is the oldest standing hospital building in the state of Michigan. The post hospital, used here for many years after its construction. It was replaced by a hospital in the 1850s. A new one was built here, and after that it served as a storehouse and other purposes at the fort. But again, the oldest standing hospital building in the state of Michigan today. Surrounding the parade ground at Fort Mackinac are a number of buildings. They housed officers, soldiers' barracks right behind me here, the barracks for the majority of the enlisted men here at Fort Mackinac, a guardhouse, the office, commissary, quartermaster, storehouse, all those typical buildings that you found at most military installations in the 19th century to support the officers and the troops that were here. In addition to officers' stone quarters, we also have officers' hill quarters looking down upon the parade ground. It, like stone quarters, was a duplex dwelling. So one officer and his family occupying one half, another occupying the other. And then beyond it, outside the fort walls, are two later officers' quarters, which are used for housing of dignitaries and VIPs who visit Mackinac Island. But those four buildings here at Fort Mackinac housed all the officers here. Some non-commissioned officers were housed in buildings out back behind the fort. They still exist today. Again, they're used for other purposes rather than museum exhibits. So a long history. Now, its military importance faded after the War of 1812. Again, we were at peace with Great Britain and Canada. With the decline of the fur trade in the 1830s, Mackinac became a little backwater for a while, so it was a kind of a quiet, sleepy post by the 1830s, and really didn't have any strategic importance. And at times, all the soldiers were pulled out of here to fight distant battles. Indian uprisings in Florida in the 1830s, the Mexican War in the 1840s, again during the Civil War, the fort became very sleepy, usually just one caretaker left behind to look after the fort. But again, it was an official military post, and those soldiers always returned once those conflicts were over. What gave Fort Mackinac a new lease on life in 1875 was the establishment of Mackinac National Park, the second national park in America. Yellowstone had just been established a few years before that. Mackinac became our second national park. And a second company of soldiers was dispatched up here to Fort Mackinac to help care for the park, because there was no park service back then. It was the soldiers at Mackinac who took care of this early national park. This was true out in Yellowstone as well. And then with the closing of Fort Mackinac by the Army in 1895, well, there were no longer soldiers here to care for the national park. So at that time, Mackinac National Park was transferred to the state of Michigan, and Mackinac Island became Mackinac Island State Park, the first state park in Michigan, and it remains a park today, almost 125 years old.
Going to place my thumb over the vent hole, and he's going to be taking our first tool called the gunner's auger or the gunner's worm.
We have cannon firings daily here throughout the summer season, as well as rifle firings. The public enjoys these demonstrations very much, and they highlight the military aspect of the fort and some of the things that the soldiers here spent their time drilling in and learning about. The cannon, back in the Victorian period here, was often used commemoratively. Fired for celebrations and to mark certain events, and that's how we use it today. We don't fire cannonballs down into the city or the harbor, but they really didn't back in the 1880s either anymore. It was, again, we always fired to welcome people, to celebrate things, and that's what we do at Fort Mackinac all summer. We welcome tens of thousands of visitors here, and part of their visit is to be welcomed by a big cannon blast up on the upper gun platform.
.906 Outdoors is brought to you in part by Blades Bait and Tackle, your year-round connection to fishing Keweenaw.
Along the shores of the Upper Peninsula, you will find over 40 lighthouses, most built in the mid-1800s. Today, several lights still guide ships safely into shore. About a dozen are open for public tours, and a few are now bed and breakfast. Michigan has more lighthouses than any other state, and they attract visitors from across the world. The Eagle Harbor Lighthouse, one of 10 lighthouses located in the Keweenaw Peninsula, and one of the easiest to find. It's located right in the town of Eagle Harbor.
Welcome to the Eagle Harbor Lighthouse in Eagle Harbor. This was built in 1871. It replaced another lighthouse that was only 20 years old, and they decided to take it down. It's fun to watch the freighters go by, and that is why we are here, because the lighthouse helped the early copper miners get their product out and also their immigrants in. We have had 22 different lighthouse keepers, and they all lived in this building. And we had 2 assistant lighthouse keepers, and they stayed usually in town in some of the boarding houses. Later on in the 1930s, they moved 2 of our other buildings here so that they could stay on site. This was the lighthouse you wanted to be at because there were schools in town, boarding houses. There was a bowling alley here in Eagle Harbor and schools. So this was a duty station that you wanted to stay at because you could have friends. You were not isolated. Everything in the lighthouse is donated because the last lighthouse keeper took all of his things with him. This is our number 4 Fresnel lens. It came from the lower entry on the Keweenaw because our number 4 Fresnel lens that was here has disappeared somehow. So we have this one now. We had to encase it in an enclosure so that nobody could touch it because it is quite valuable. This is our third light here in Eagle Harbor. Our first one was this one, the Fresnel lens. Our second one was a beacon for an airplane beacon. We had red and white. Our signal is red and white every 10 seconds. We continue to have that signal. Copper Harbor is green. And our third light that is up in our tower right now is a very modern looking light, actually smaller than our Fresnel lens is.
A Fresnel lens uses a series of stepped pieces of glass or prisms to capture and refract light.
The prisms would focus the light into one direction so that it could go out and you could see it farther.
Lights are rated by size, with a first order light being the largest and sixth order the smallest.
Now this is a number 1. Our light is a number 4. A number 1 is usually located on the oceans. There are no number 1s on the Great Lakes. This one is located in Oregon. Most of the ones on the Great Lakes are number 3s and 4s. Over here was our backup light when we had the airport beacon, and it was located outside because it did not have any of the electrical connections that could go on its own. So this is battery operated. And when they took our airport beacon out, they took this out also, and the Coast Guard let us have it to display. And it does light up every 10 seconds. And this is our tower. Now these stairs are in many different lighthouses. You know, you'll see them. You can see that they're all coming off the center post. This is the lighthouse keeper's room. In the early days, of course, they had to have a stove like this attached to the chimney because they didn't get a furnace until 1907. The Historical Society has owned and run this building since 1982. Almost all the lighthouses are automated now. And again, our signal is red and white every 10 seconds. And we are a working light, so visitors are not allowed in the light room, in the lens room up at the top of the tower, which disappoints many of them, I'm sorry to say. On the site, we have other buildings besides the lighthouse. This is our fog signal building right there, and originally was a whistle, a steam whistle, and they realized by the time they got the steam whistle hooked up that the fog was gone. So later on, they got a diaphone fog signal.
Lake Superior stretches as far as the eye can see. From the top of the tower, you can also see the unique features of this light station that helps sailors navigate the harbor.
The bellbuoy marks the entrance to the harbor. It also marks a reef, which is just to the east of the bellbuoy, so that the boats don't hit it. Right now our water's pretty high, so it's not a real problem. But normally when the water's a lot lower, you can see the rocks. And then they have to use our 2 range rocks, which are located on the south beach, and line up, and then they can go between the range rocks and make it safely into the harbor without hitting any other reefs. The boats have to go around that bellbuoy, and then they line up on the shore over there, are the 2 range lights. The range light are the two lights on the shore, one high, one low, to get boats into the harbor, which they must go through those two range rocks. They were built there in 1895, and they are 14 feet deep between them. And the reason they needed to be deeper was because as the ships were bringing in more and more people and miners and people looking for jobs up here, and also copper was heavy, and they needed the depth to get through there. They dynamited it actually to be deep enough. And then in the background is the Coast Guard boathouse. The boathouse itself is owned by the state of Michigan, and they allow us to put our displays in there. We have several boats in there. It was operated as a life-saving or Coast Guard station starting in 1939. Many, many rescues went on from there. The Keweenaw Paranormal Association came out and investigated us about 5 years ago, and they did certify that we have a ghost in the lighthouse, and we also have a ghost in the White Building. And so that's another interesting story, and several of the lighthouse keepers and their assistants did mention that at the time. So we are certified that we do have a ghost. Come and visit our ghosts. We have visitors from around the world, over 12,000 seasonally, and of course there are people here at night, and there are people here in the morning when we're not open. People love to come here, so we're very happy that they do.
Feel free to join us on Facebook or visit us at 906outdoors.com. And while you're there, be sure to sign up to get on the 906 Outdoors email list. We'll send you an occasional email with tips, recipes, and more. You'll also be eligible for giveaways just for being on the list. Thanks for watching, and we invite you to join us next week for another adventure right here on 906 Outdoors.